Three knights gazed in wonder at the white stag. "Here, take this," Annie said to Jack. She handed him the silver cup. Then she slipped off the back of Lancelot's horse and ran to the stag. "Thanks for coming for us," she cried, throwing her arms around his neck. The three knights looked at Jack. "That's the white stag," said Jack. "He brought us here." "Are you wizards?" Sir Percival asked in a hushed voice. "No, just ordinary kids," said Jack. "But I know he's magic. We got here from Camelot in no time at all. I guess he's here to take us back." "Then you must go with him," said Sir Lancelot. "You will have a much faster journey, I can assure you." Sir Lancelot held the silver cup as Jack slipped down from the black horse. Then Jack took the cup and carefully climbed onto the back of the stag behind Annie. He held the cup with both hands as the stag stood up. "Tell King Arthur we will return to Camelot before the first night of the new year," said Sir Lancelot. "Farewell, Jack and Annie," said Sir Galahad. "Godspeed," said Sir Percival. "Same to you," said Annie. "Have a safe trip," said Jack. The knights solemnly bowed. The white stag blew out a puff of frosty air, then he started down the mountainside. When the stag came to the base of the mountain, he took off again like a white comet. The red cloak billowed around Jack and Annie, keeping them safe and warm. The stag dashed across the wintry fields. He ran past quiet stables and thatched huts. He ran past flocks of sheep and herds of goats asleep in the meadows. He leaped over frozen streams and stone walls and hedgerows. The stag ran on through the starry night until he brought Jack and Annie back to the dark castle grounds of Camelot. He walked over the frozen grass of the outer courtyard. He came to a halt near the grove below the treehouse. He knelt in the grass, and Jack and Annie climbed off his back. Miraculously, the silver cup still brimmed full with water from the cauldron. Not a drop had spilled. "We better leave the cloak here," said Jack, "so I don't trip on it." Jack carefully set the cup on the ground. Annie helped him unbutton the red velvet cloak from around his neck. Then she draped it over the stag's back. "To keep you warm and safe," she whispered, "and thanks for everything." "Yes, thanks," said Jack. "Goodbye." The white stag stared at them with mysterious amber eyes. He nodded once. Then he turned and headed into the darkness. Jack picked up the cup. "Come on," he said. He started walking quickly through the outer courtyard. "Careful, careful," said Annie. I got it," said Jack. They crossed the drawbridge to the inner courtyard of the castle. Then they pushed open the giant arched doors. The great hall was just as they had left it, dimly lit, freezing cold. King Arthur, Queen Genevieve, and the Knights of the Round Table, and Morgan Le Fay were still frozen and silent. "What do we do now?" said Jack. "Let's try putting a drop of water on each of them. Morgan first," said Annie. "Okay," said Jack. "Come on." Holding his breath and keeping his eyes on the cup, Jack walked carefully toward the round table. Suddenly his left foot stepped on the shoelace of his right sneaker, and he stumbled. "Jack!" yelled Annie. Jack tried to regain his balance, but it was too late. As he fell to the floor, the silver cup slipped from his hands. Jack and Annie watched in horror as the water from the cup splashed over the stone floor. It trickled into the cracks between the stones and disappeared. Jack scrambled to the cup. He picked it up. It was completely empty. "Oh, no!" Jack moaned. He sat back and put his head in his hands. Camelot will never wake up now, he thought. The legend will end forever. "Jack!" said Annie. "Look!" Jack raised his head. He pushed his glasses into place. A golden cloud was rising from the cracks between the stones of the floor. The cloud spread quickly throughout the great hall, filling the room with wonderful smells, the scent of cedar smoke and evergreen and roses and almonds. The cloud rose up and up, then wafted out through the upper windows of the hall. Suddenly, a white dove flew through one of the windows. It soared across the dark room like a bright light, then swooped back out into the night. Soft, gentle laughter came from the end of the hall. The laughter grew louder and louder. Jack saw King Arthur and Queen Genevieve looking at one another. They were laughing. The Knights of the Round Table were laughing too. Best of all, Jack saw Morgan Le Fay smiling at him and Annie. "Jack! Annie! Come here!" she called. She held out her arms. "Morgan!" cried Annie. She ran to Morgan and threw her arms around the enchantress. Jack stood up, still holding the empty cup. He ran to Morgan and hugged her too. "We did what the Christmas night told us to do," said Annie. "We brought back the water of memory and imagination." "But I dropped the cup," said Jack, "and spilled all the water." "But the water made a gold cloud," said Annie, "and everyone came back to life." Morgan laughed with amazement. "You have just returned from the other world?" she asked. "Yes," said Annie. "A white stag brought us back," said Jack. He turned to King Arthur. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have good news. Your knights are safe. Sir Lancelot said to tell you they'll be home before the first night of the new year." The king looked bewildered. "You found them?" "Yes, and they're all fine," said Annie. "Here," said Jack. He handed the silver cup to the king. "Please give this back to Sir Galahad." "And this to Sir Lancelot," said Annie. She took the glass key from around her neck and gave it to King Arthur. "Oh, and this to Sir Percival," said Jack. He pulled the wooden compass box from his pack and gave it to the king. At first, King Arthur was too stunned to speak. Then he clapped his hands and laughed joyfully. "Thank you," he said to Jack and Annie. The Knights of the Round Table all cheered. "Ring the bells!" King Arthur shouted. "Call the people of Camelot to the castle." "They have already gathered outside your doors, your Majesty," said a page. "Bring them in," said King Arthur. "We must rejoice together." Queen Genevieve smiled at Jack and Annie. Her eyes sparkled now. "Once again, you have helped save Camelot." "Thank you very much." "You're welcome," said Jack and Annie together. Then Jack heard the sounds of children talking and laughing. He turned to see a crowd of people streaming through the arched doorway of the great hall. They carried candles, a giant fir tree, boughs of holly and pine. Musicians followed them with string instruments. As everyone started to decorate the hall, the musicians began playing and singing a beautiful Christmas carol. "Jack," said Annie, "look!" The white stag was standing in the arched doorway. Jack turned excitedly to Morgan. "See that white stag?" he said. "He took us to the other world. See him?" Morgan smiled. "Yes, I do see him, and now I see everything." Jack looked back at the doorway. The stag was gone. In his place stood an old man with a long white beard. He held a staff and wore a flowing red cloak, the same cloak Jack and Annie had worn on their quest. "Who is that?" Jack asked. "That is Merlin the magician," said Morgan. "It was Merlin who invited you here. I see that now." "Merlin," said Jack. "He sent us the royal invitation?" "Yes," said Morgan. "Then he put the rest of us under a spell, and he carried you to the other world." "No," said Annie. "The Christmas night put you under a spell, and the white stag carried us to the other world," said Jack. Morgan smiled. "Merlin was both the Christmas night and the white stag," she said. "Remember, he's a magician, not a mortal. He can change his shape whenever he wishes." "Oh, wow," whispered Annie. "Why did Merlin do those things?" asked Jack. "Merlin was angry when King Arthur banned magic from Camelot," said Morgan. "I see now he finally took matters into his own hands." "How?" said Jack. "He knew King Arthur would send no more knights to the other world for the water of memory and imagination," said Morgan. "So I assume he brought you to Camelot hoping that you'd offer to go instead." "Why did he want us to go?" asked Annie. "Merlin has often heard my tales of your adventures in the treehouse," said Morgan. "He knows you both have a great desire to fight for the good, and he knows you use the gift of imagination very well. Those are two special qualities needed to succeed in any quest." Jack and Annie looked back at Merlin. From far across the room, the white-bearded magician smiled at them. He raised his staff, then he slipped out the door. Jack looked around the great hall. All the candles and torches were lit now. A fire blazed in the hearth. The musicians were playing. Everyone was singing. The room glowed with warm firelight and rosy faces. At last, Christmas in Camelot was just as Jack had imagined it would be. The spell of the dark wizard had been broken. The great hall was filled with beauty and love and joy and light. "Wake up, Jack," said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. He was lying in the dark on the wooden floor of the treehouse. Through the window he saw the cloudy sky above the Frog Creek woods. "It's time to go home," said Annie. "Oh, I must have fallen asleep," said Jack. "I had the most incredible dream. I dreamed that we went to Camelot. It was Christmas, and Merlin—" "That wasn't a dream," said Annie. "It was real. You fell asleep at the round table during the party. King Arthur carried you to the treehouse, and I made the wish for us to come home." Jack sat up. "Serious?" he asked. "Seriously," said Annie. "Jack! Annie!" their mom called in the distance. "Coming!" Annie shouted out of the treehouse window. She turned to Jack. "Let's go!" "I mean, seriously? It really happened?" Jack asked Annie again. "Yes, really," she said. She held up the royal invitation. "See? Proof." "Oh, yeah," he whispered. "This time the letter M stood for Merlin, not Morgan," said Annie. Jack smiled. "Thanks, Merlin," he said softly. Jack picked up his backpack. Then he and Annie started down the rope ladder and headed home. As they walked through the deep December twilight, snowflakes started to fall. By the time they left the woods and headed down their street, snow was swirling everywhere. Ahead they could see their house glowing with lamplight. Their mom was waiting on their front porch. "Hi, Mom," said Annie. "Hi, Mom," said Jack. "Hey, kids, did you have a good day?" she asked. "Yeah," said Jack. "Pretty good," said Annie. "I'm glad," said their mom. "Welcome home." She held the door open and Jack and Annie slipped inside. Their house felt extra warm and cozy. Good smells came from the kitchen. Jack and Annie took off their snow-covered jackets and headed up the stairs. In the hallway, Annie turned to Jack. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. Annie slipped into her room and Jack into his. Jack closed his door and sat on his bed. He took his notebook out of his backpack and opened it. His spirit sank. Except for the 3 rhymes, he had taken no notes on their journey. Not one. Exhausted, Jack lay back on his bed. He squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to remember the details of their adventure in Camelot and the other world. He could feel the terrible chill in the great hall when Morgan was frozen. He could hear the joyful music as the winged dancers danced around in their circle. He could taste the sweet, bitter, spicy taste of the water of memory and imagination. Jack sat up all at once. He felt very awake. He turned to a clean page in his notebook. He grabbed his pencil and wrote, "It all started when we saw the white dove in the twilight." Using his memory and his imagination, Jack kept writing, doing his part to keep the legend of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, and Morgan Le Fay alive. As the snow swirled around his window, Jack wrote and wrote. He didn't stop writing until he'd written down the whole story. His story of their Christmas in Camelot. A note from the author. Many people believe that the legend of King Arthur was inspired by an actual military leader who led Britain over 1,500 years ago. Imaginary stories about the adventures of King Arthur were first told in Wales and Ireland. These stories are called Celtic myths. Sadly, most Celtic myths are lost to us forever, because only a few were written down. Many details in my story about King Arthur's realm are drawn from details in the few Celtic stories that have survived through the ages. The cloak that makes one invisible was considered to be one of the 13 treasures of Britain. Merlin the magician was said to keep the treasures in a glass tower. None of the magic of the treasures would work for a person who was unworthy to use them. The white stag was inspired by a supernatural Celtic beast that often led humans to a hidden other world. The idea for the cauldron of memory and imagination came from a 6th century poem. The poem tells the story about King Arthur and his knights traveling to a hidden world and searching for a magical cauldron of poetry and inspiration. Many knights never returned from that dangerous quest. In the 12th century, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine encouraged poets and troubadours to make up more stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table to inspire her people. In the following years, storytellers all over Europe told heroic tales of King Arthur, Merlin, Sir Lancelot, Queen Genevieve, and Morgan Le Fay. French poets were the first to call the imaginary kingdom Camelot. The storytellers in the Middle Ages blended elements of Christianity with old Celtic myths. In their stories, miracles and marvels often took place around Christian holidays. Christmas in Camelot was a time of joyous celebration. Thanks, H. I hope you're feeling better.